Welcome back to another episode of Healing Conversations with Jessica Alla. I am your host, Jessica Alla, Australia's leading women's trauma therapist and founder of Aruka Therapy. So today we're going to be talking about complex trauma and working with clients with complex trauma, because it's one of those things that it is a lot more difficult to work with a client with complex trauma. It's just the reality of it. I don't like to box my clients into categories generally. I don't even really like the diagnosis of complex trauma, but it is really helpful to know when somebody falls into the category of essentially the definition of complex trauma is somebody who's experienced ongoing, repeated trauma. So whether this is through a long-term relationship or whether this was through an abusive childhood or a neglectful childhood, it's trauma that is not an isolated event. So there's a difference between, being in an accident or having one big traumatic thing happen to you in your life versus your upbringing just being a traumatic experience every single day. It's the daily ongoing traumas that sometimes we can't even put words to. Sometimes it's not even, we can't even really describe what happened to us as one traumatic memory. It was the way that we were spoken to every day. Or it was, slammed doors and arguments and walking on eggshells. And, it's not one isolated event, it's multiple events. Now, with complex trauma, there is a scale. And this is the thing that a lot of people miss. You can have the experience of complex trauma or the symptoms of complex trauma from an emotionally neglectful home or a home, like I said, where you're walking around, you're tiptoeing around. These people are still going to experience personality effects. We won't call them disorders because that's probably more up this end, but they will have effects on their personality because being treated a certain way every single day throughout your childhood is creating your personality, which is your personal reality. So in that first 10 years of life, children are 100% of the time in the first 10 years of life, or 100% of the time in the first 7 years of life, up until 10 years in a theta brainwave. Now, a theta brainwave is the brainwave where you have access to your subconscious mind. It's the brainwave where we do hypnosis. So children are essentially for the first 10 years of their life in a completely hypnotic-like state. And the reason for this is that they're developing their belief systems about who they are, how the world operates, who they have to be in the world, and everything that they need to know in order to keep them safe. So on this end of the spectrum, on this end where we have emotional needs aren't being met, they're being told to be quiet, to shut up, to stop crying, they're being, isolated, being put in their bedroom, they're being, just not having their emotional needs met, reoccurring. Throughout their childhood, they start to develop this feeling of like, I'm not important and nobody cares about me. And they start to develop a personality that is intertwined with the trauma itself. And so it can actually, for the people with complex trauma, be really difficult for them to see that this was the trauma and this is who I am. Who they are becomes a part of the trauma. So this is this in a sentence is what makes complex trauma so complex, is that it needs to become untangled from our identity. People who've had a few bad things happen to them can see that the bad thing happened to them and that they are who they are. People with complex trauma believe that they are the bad things that happened to them or the things that didn't happen to them. So at one end of the scale, we have complex trauma that's ongoing and repetitive, that is like a lack of emotional needs being met, and an identity that is like, no one loves me, no one cares about me, I can't feel my emotions, up to the other end of the spectrum. And the other end of the spectrum is personality disorders. It's psychosis, it's BPD, it's DID, it's people that have had to develop multiple personalities because of ongoing complex trauma that is extremely abusive in nature. And there are similarities. So there's a lot of talk in the trauma industry at the moment, in the trauma world at the moment, saying that all trauma is trauma. And that whether you're on whatever end of the spectrum you're on, it doesn't really matter what happened, it matters what happens inside. And this is not true. what happened matters and how frequently it happened also matters. So the thing with complex trauma is the frequency, and then there is a scale on top of that. So I have complex trauma clients who heal in a couple of sessions because their trauma was, on the end of the spectrum where they didn't have to completely dissociate to leave their body. They didn't have to create multiple personalities. They didn't have to create extreme protective coping mechanisms to survive their situation. They just weren't having their needs met. Now, that's still a big thing, and this person can still be in a really tough spot in their life, but it is different to working with the other end of the spectrum, which is people that have been, repeatedly beaten, kidnapped, assaulted, raped, like child abuse, like that level of coping and what the brain and the body has to do to cope with that situation is completely different. Now, there's not many therapists that specialize, or not enough therapists that specialize in complex trauma and that can understand this full spectrum and that can understand the different ways that we have to cope and the different ways that our brain has to adapt to deal with that situation. So when we're talking the more intense side of things, a lot of therapists tend to shy away from it. They say, I'm not qualified to speak to complex trauma. I'm not qualified to work with this level of trauma. And they're sending them off to other people who do specialize. But even the people who specialize aren't going deep enough and aren't actually often addressing the memories. So the first thing when we think about this complex trauma that results in personality disorders, psychosis, schizophrenia, things like that, is that we have to be processing the memories. And I talk about this in every single episode, but we have to be understanding how to correctly process those memories, how to shift the subconscious beliefs around who they decided that they had to become in order to survive their situation so that they can know that that was then and this is now. So the reason that I think we shy away from working with these more intense, complex situations, and this has been my personal history, but also my work history has been working with, I specialize in people with drug addiction, people with PTSD, people with schizophrenia, people with psychosis, because I wanted to understand how to help. My concept over the last 15 years was, if I can understand how to help these people that nobody can help, that is like the most intense versions of mental health issues, then everything else is going to be a breeze. And that's the way I teach it to my students, is that once you learn how to work with the big stuff, everything else is a ripple on effect from that, and it becomes quite easy. So working with complex trauma, now obviously listening to this podcast does not qualify you. There's trainings in place, but I want to give you a bit of an understanding around what we actually need to do for that person with that end of the spectrum that is, as I said, the things that people just don't even imagine happen to people, the things that people just can't even comprehend, the things that we don't even want to speak about. And this is the first point that I want to make, is that it's so difficult for you to hold something that you're uncomfortable about. And a lot of the time as therapists, people will shy away from going into those things because I can't even imagine what that would be like to experience that. I don't even know how to fix that, because like, how the fuck does anyone live through that? And they've got their own fears and their own perceptions around it. So the first thing that we need to be doing is shifting our perception of what's possible and understanding, like, as somebody who's had most types of trauma, or every type of trauma, really, I can't think of one that I haven't had, they all are processed in the exact same way. So once you've got a method that works, once you've got a method that actually allows you to correctly process it in the brain, it doesn't really matter what's happening. It doesn't matter like what the trauma is. It's the same method and it's the same function. Now, where it starts to change is when we start to work with this more intense trauma. We start to witness these different parts or these fragments of self. And so I can give a personal example again where there was a memory that I had tried to process, and it was the only memory that I'd ever processed that didn't fully process. What I mean when I say that is, normally we work on a memory once and within a couple of weeks we can think back to that memory and we feel good. We feel like did it really even happen? And we feel calm, we feel safe. There's nothing attached to it. There was this one memory where it was the worst memory of my life easily. And what actually happened and what I discovered in the process of healing this memory, which is something that needs to be far more studied and researched, was that in order to cope with the event, my brain fragmented in that one memory into multiple parts. Now, this isn't new. We know that dissociative identity disorder exists. It used to be called multiple personality disorder, and that people can create alters and multiple versions of themselves to cope with situations that are horrendous and the human mind is unable to cope with it. But what's interesting is that when we're healing, we actually need to work with each of those alters and each of those fragments because they have different perceptions, different emotions that they're holding, different beliefs that they're holding, different versions of what happened. And they sometimes even are holding different parts of the memory. So what happened for me was that I felt like I'd processed the memory, but there was another part holding another part of the memory that I couldn't access until I'd worked on this, and then on this one part, and then the next part would come up. So there was a part that felt disgust, and she only remembered the disgusting parts of it. There was a part that felt terror. There was a part that thought she was going to die. There was a part, and each of them, it was the only way I can describe it is that like I had left my body, and the memory had moved into scenes. And instead of it being one whole memory, there was scenes, and I knew that they were from the same day and from the same memory, but I couldn't access them as one. They were very much fragmented. This is what can happen with this acute trauma where there's just no way for them to comprehend or to cope with what's happening. It doesn't mean that you don't access it. It doesn't mean that you avoid it. It doesn't mean that you don't go into it. It means that you use the same techniques and tools that you would to process memories and to find the subconscious beliefs and to somatically release and to allow the body to get involved and to heal and to move through it on each of those individual parts and these different alters or fragments, whatever you want to call them. They just need to be done individually because the scale of terror and panic in that moment cause that fragmentation. So we need to heal those fragments. So trying to like pull it all together and do it as one isn't going to work. You're not going to remember it. The parts are going to fight. They're not going to work together. So this is where working with parts and fragments is really powerful for people with complex trauma. And this is what makes it a bit more of a lengthy process, is that we actually have to start to split those memories into parts, and we have to actually start to communicate with the parts sometimes instead of the memories. So this is where I think a lot of it, once you understand the concept of it, it's actually quite simple, and there is a method and there is a way that we can actually help these people to shift. But it just is one of those things that people become really afraid of because they're afraid of re-traumatization. They're afraid of doing the wrong thing. And I completely understand that. And this is why I'm so passionate about teaching how to work with all levels of trauma and all scales of trauma right up to that level, because that's what I've been through and that's what I understand. And this is the thing that a lot of people don't fully recognize or understand, is that there's one thing to like research something and to study something, and there's another thing altogether to experience it yourself and to actually move through it and to notice what shifted and what did work and what didn't work and to actually notice the changes in your body. It's a whole other thing completely. And a lot of the research that's been done on complex trauma has been done by researchers who don't necessarily have complex trauma themselves and don't understand the ways in which our brain has to fragment and in order to function. So no matter what spectrum we're looking at, there is, as I mentioned, always a focus on identity, because at the end of the day, once you process what happened, and when I say process what happened, what I mean is you understand, you have a new narrative for what happened. And a lot of the time, as I've mentioned in many previous episodes, confusion is one of the most traumatic things. When we're a child and we don't understand what's happening, that confusion stays stored, and that's what allows the memory to stay open, because we're still trying to figure it out essentially. But that confusion moves when we process the memory correctly and we step into that memory and we give that child a new narrative. So they've got a new narrative and understanding from an adult perspective, It's kind of like accessing the memory with your adult mind so that you can look at it from a new lens. The second part is uncovering the subconscious beliefs that this person created about who they are and how the world works in that moment. So this is the identity. Who did they believe that they had to be as a result of what happened? Did they believe that they had to be weak because if they were strong or they fought back, they'd get in trouble? Or did they believe that they had to be invisible because when they were, when they were showing up, they were being attacked. And so they had to try and be invisible. Did they believe that they were helpless and there was no way out because there was no one there to protect them? Who did they believe that they had to be, or who did they believe that they were as a result of what happened? Unraveling those identity levels as well as processing the memories so that they can shift the emotions and somatically release so that their body can know that that has passed. Pairing that together with the identity work is the most powerful thing that we can do for these clients with complex trauma. And it takes a little bit longer because within each memory, there is a subconscious belief. There is a level of identity in each memory. And so we're not talking about, 3 or 4 or 5 incidences in childhood where maybe someone said something mean to them one day in primary school, or there was a death in the family, or there was a few important events that happened that can be processed. As I said, it's hundreds of memories. And this is the only downfall to, this type of therapy is that you do actually have to process a lot of those memories individually. And people don't often like going back into them. But on the flip side of this, there are a lot of memories that are of the same nature. And when you heal the foundational one, a lot of them do shift, but there still can sometimes be, I can't even tell you how many memories I've processed now. Like I literally have lost count and the amount of beliefs that I've had to shift as a result of it. But this is what makes it more complicated, is the duration, is going back in and unraveling their identity, as well as the protective parts that come forward. There is nobody more self-sabotaging and protective of themselves and of actually doing the work than somebody with complex trauma. And this is one of those things that, again, I'm really passionate about teaching people. How do we work with the protective parts and how do we work with protection? And it shows up as blocks. It shows up as them saying, nah, that didn't really affect me, even though you know in every cell of your body that it absolutely would have affected them. It's the person who says like, oh, that just happened and it's the most traumatic thing you've ever heard, but they're completely dissociated. It's the person who checks out, who's not there, who leaves their body. It's understanding the scale of trauma and what a person has to do in order to cope with that trauma, and then what their protective patterns are going to be as a result of that so that we can work around them. Like I know now straight away, there are thousands of ways that a client can block you from accessing their protective parts or from progressing in their healing. And it's just finding that balance between lovingly letting them know that they're protecting themselves, removing whatever that layer of protection is. And this is where that, what's the worst thing that could happen comes into play. I talk about this with my clients all the time. When a protective part comes in, they're trying to do their job. So we're asking them, what's the worst thing that could happen? We're uncovering the root cause of the root fear, essentially, of what they think is the worst thing that could happen. We're shifting it at a subconscious level, sometimes somatics as well. And then we're able to progress forward with the session. But so many therapists don't have this understanding of like how you uncover those blocks and how to know when someone's shutting down and protecting themselves, how to identify that, and then how to actually move through it and shift through it. This is where we need to be more skilled when we're working with complex trauma. How to actually shift it, how to notice it first, be aware of it, how to shift it, and in order to be able to access those deeper layers to keep moving them through the next layer of memories, of beliefs, of subconscious, until they get to this point where there's so many layers to this. And this is why I have my program Triggered to Thriving, because there's so many layers that we come up against. Once we start to feel more safe, there's this like unsafety that comes up in feeling safe, because it's like feeling safe feels unsafe because then you're not protected and you're not protecting yourself. You need to be able to identify these layers that your clients are going to go through and the order in which they're going to go through it so that you can actually start to unlock and uncover the next layer and the next layer, and to keep guiding them through and to keep moving them forward. So if you're wanting to learn more about this, I have a program called The Missing Link Between Brain, Body and Belief. And it's kind of just an intro into this work, how to blend it all together, how it all works, how nervous system, subconscious, somatics all relates back into trauma. It's $9.95. You can find it at the bottom of this episode. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with somebody that you think might need it, somebody that's in the industry. And thank you for listening.